Marcy, do you want to get started? All right, everybody. While people are still coming in, let's get started. I'm really pleased to welcome Meredith Kelly to give our UTIG seminar today. Meredith's research contributes to understanding how glaciers and ice sheets exist in a varying climate. And she has worked all over the world. She got her PhD at the University of Bern, where she worked on the Swiss Alps. She then moved to Ohio State, working with the infamous Lonnie Thompson, moving on to Lamont, where she eventually turned into a research scientist there, much like much of the audience, and then got a job at Dartmouth, where she's been since, I think, 2009 or something like that. Yeah. And so, yeah, please welcome Meredith, and she's going to talk about the tropical high altitude climate conditions during the last glacial maximum.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Great. Okay. Thank you, Jenny, so much for the introduction. So I'm so excited to be here, and I'm glad there's like one Dartmouth alum representing in the audience, and I know Nathan through Dartmouth Connections, so I really appreciate having those connections. It's my first time in Austin. It's my first time visiting here, so yeah, it's been fun. Austin seems like a great place to be, and this is a pretty amazing facility here. So see if I can get this to work. So my talk is focused on understanding high altitude, low latitude temperatures through using glaciers, and really focused on the last glacial maximum, so the height of the last glacial period. This is, of course, a collaboration, as is most of our work these days. And I'm lucky enough to have this fantastic collaborative team, working with Jim Russell, who's at Brown University, a good colleague, Alice Dowdy, who was a postdoc at Dartmouth and is now at the University of Maine. Gordon Bromley, who's at Galway in Ireland. Sergio Restrepo Moreno, who's in Colombia. Adolfo Quesada Raman, who's in Costa Rica, and Max Cunningham, who now works for the federal government. So really international team. And of course, none of this would be possible without students. So I know there's some students in the audience, and I just want to start with that recognition that, you know, I am old. I've been at Dartmouth a long time. I'm, you know, for better or worse right now, department chair. So I do a lot of administrative stuff and all kinds of other things that bring me true joy. And these are the folks who really get to have a lot of fun and do a lot of the work. So, you know, the work that I'm going to be presenting today are papers that have come out from these students and that are coming along. And I guess I'll point out a couple of the recent undergrads. Lexi and Lauren, and Lexi, I think, is trying to go back to graduate school this year and has some sites. She's from Houston originally. She has some sites into UT Austin. So if you see her come knocking on your door, give her a chance. She's amazing. So big picture, I'm a glacial geologist. I'm a field geologist, and I have some geochronological methods too. I also work with lake sediments, and my real interest throughout my career has been in studying Quaternary climate change. And this, to me, is fascinating, right? This is sort of a, you know, a cartoon picture of this. But the Quaternary is this amazing period, the last 2.5 million years, when climate on Earth finally got cold enough that we can have large ice sheets in the Northern Hemisphere. That's cool, right? And right now I'm not actually teaching, I'm helping out with an undergrad class, but I was saying the other day that we're so worried about global warming, but we're actually in one of the coldest times of Earth history. So this is fun, and this is the amazing thing that's happened in the Quaternary, is that we get these phenomenal glacial interglacial cycles, right, over the period in the last million years of a repetitive period of about 100,000 years, and punctuated by really rapid climate changes, right? The ends of ice ages. So that's really these questions about what caused these and how they manifest in Earth systems that we understand are really the basis of what drives me as a scientist. Now, I know if I ask you what drives glacial interglacial climate change during the Quaternary, you'll say, Milankovitch, right? And this is what I teach in class, and this is what's in all the textbooks. And I want I want to go with this and then also put some curiosity in your minds as to, is this the whole story? Or is this actually the driver? And to start with that, I'll remind us what Milankovitch is, right? Milankovitch is basically saying that these changes in Earth's orbit that are changes in the tilt, eccentricity, and precession of Earth's orbit cause small changes in the amount of sunlight that Earth receives on its surface over time, right? And it's these changes in sunlight that drive the growth and shrinkage of large ice sheets in the Northern Hemisphere. Where is that important and when is that important? So this is simply orbital change, right? But Milankovitch, the key to Milankovitch is that the sum of these changes impacts the amount of incoming solar radiation at high latitudes in the north at about 65 degrees north latitude in the summertime, right? And that's because ice sheets and glaciers don't really care how cold it got in the winter or how warm it gets in the winter, because in this place, it's typically freezing during the winter, right? They really care how cold and warm it gets in the summer, right? So if you can make summers cold enough in these high northern latitudes where there's lots of land and you can grow large ice sheets, you can grow ice sheets, right? So that's the key to Milankovitch. And, we can test that. Of course, people have been testing this since Milankovitch came out in the 1940s and 50s, right? So this plot is from a paper by a former mentor of mine, George Denton, who's at the University of Maine, who thinks on these big picture questions. And what's shown in red is this insolation or incoming solar radiation at 65 degrees north latitude in the summertime. So exactly what we were just saying, Milankovitch forcing. And in blue over here, this is the Lasecki and Ramo 2004 benthic oxygen isotope stack that can be interpreted to represent global ice volume. Okay, and you can see, like, let's just take the last sort of 500,000, 400 to 500,000 years here. We can see in the blue line, the last few glacial periods here, 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 and here, the last interglacial periods here, here, and these rapid changes from glacial to interglacial. And there is a coincidence, right, with Milankovitch forcing. So when there are large increases in insolation, often those ends of ice ages, the transition from glacial to interglacial conditions, otherwise known as terminations, coincide with those large increases in insolation. However, there are also times where there's not that overlap, right? Where there's like a large termination and there's actually not a large increase in insolation, right? This is a really interesting paper. This sets up the idea of how terminations happen in a cascade of events that is kicked off when there's enough ice in the Northern Hemisphere marked by sort of the isotope records that go below this dashed line. Mo Ramo termed this excess ice, so that their ice sheets were large enough on the planet so that when you started to warm them up at the end of the last ice age, they would flush out icebergs into the North Atlantic and be able to change circulation in the North Atlantic and set off this cascade of events that involves North Atlantic deep water circulation, a transition of the ITCZ to the south, and then ultimately an increase in the southern westerly winds that increases upwelling, increasing CO2, locking in that glacial to interglacial transition, okay? So complicated paper, basically saying that there's this forcing from Milankovitch and requiring some configurations of ice sheets. So there's problems with this, though, and this is not new, and this is not my idea. This goes back to John Mercer, who was a professor at Ohio State before I was there, and John Mercer did an incredible amount of work on glaciers in the Southern Hemisphere. And what he recognized from these records, even back in the 80s when they were radiocarbon dating these records, right? We didn't have the methods that I'm talking about here with plasmogenic nuclide dating or anything like that. He called this Mercer's paradox, or more appropriately, we call this Mercer's paradox, but he called it was at that point the fly in the ointment of ice age cycles. Okay, so there are problems with this, right? And this graph that's published in a more recent paper by George Denton, highlights this. So what this shows is here time on the x-axis. So essentially the last glacial to interglacial transition. And two records, or three records actually. The blue is the West Antarctic ice sheet divide ice core temperature record. The points are moraines showing glacial extents in the southern Alps of New Zealand. And this record is a sea surface temperature from the North Atlantic. And what's curious about this is that you can see two things. The first is that what it looks like that these glacial periods are global, right? Which is weird because it's not what's predicted by Milankovitch, right? When you have cold summers in the northern hemisphere, causing ice sheets to grow in the northern hemispheres and then shrink, and when those summers warm, the opposite is happening in the southern hemisphere. You actually have warm summers. So you should have glaciers and temperatures increasing when melting when there's growth in the northern hemisphere. So we don't have that sort of bipolar pattern. And the ends of these ice ages are really rapid, known as terminations, this term I introduced before. And they're faster than can be explained by these Milankovitch ideas, okay? So this is a good problem to have, because it's always good to have problems in sciences. And I guess, let me go back here for a second and say, you know, the way that the global nature of glacial periods is explained is through feedbacks, right? So ice sheets grow, and then they have these feedbacks that include albedo, and then potentially the ability to change radiative forcing by influencing CO2 greenhouse gas concentrations, right? And so it's that link that then globalizes glacial periods and interglacial periods. So this is really interesting. And one could ask, well, okay, what are the records for this, right? And one record I want to point out that came out recently from the tropics, which is where I'll eventually take this talk in a few slides, I promise. This is a new record from lake sediments that were drilled in Lake Juanin, which is in the Peruvian Andes. And this is such a cool record because it's one of the longest tropical records for temperature change. And there are a lot of records here, but let me focus you on this one up here. This is by Don Rodbell and others. And what's shown here in green is the Lake Juanin like glacial z-score, which is essentially a record of glacial expansions and contractions tracked by clastic sediment in lakes. And then here is this Lisecki and Ramos stack that I showed before. It's inverted. So now the glacial periods are up here and the interglacials are down here. But you see a really nice correspondence between glaciers in the tropical Andes and indicating temperature to me, and I'll argue that in a little bit, and global ice volume. So there is this connection, and Rodbell and others argue that this is Milankovitch forcing forced through greenhouse gases and feedbacks from the ice sheets. So this is great, but I want to interrogate it a little bit more. I'll use these two graphs to show you this. And the questions I guess I'll start with are what are these mechanisms that link high latitude summer insolation and the large ice sheets with greenhouse gases? And then what causes the terminations? And these two I'm like linking together in a ways here because I think they're related. And I think that by understanding terminations, we can understand these linkages better. So two different papers, and I apologize because the x-axes are inverted. So I was lazy and I did not replot these data, I'm sorry. So the first is a study by Jeremy Shakin in 2015. And what he shows is a global proxy temperature compilation that he did. That's in blue, that shows sort of global temperature, surface temperature evolution since the LGM through the Holocene. This is a great temperature record. It's biased a little bit towards the Northern Hemisphere because many of the records that exist are from the Northern Hemisphere. The red is the Antarctic temperature record from the Antarctic ice core, and the yellow is CO2 from the Antarctic ice core. And what you can see is that these are all sort of, there's some really interesting patterns here in the lake glacial that we can talk about later, but focusing on this termination, the LGM and the termination, is that there was a hint of a little bit of warming in the global record. And this is about 0.3 degrees, but there's something going on before CO2 goes up, right? So there's some indication here that like that direct connection of changes in the ice sheets causing somehow changes in greenhouse gases falls apart a little bit here. Okay, this is also highlighted again in a record from George Denton's group with work in the Southern Alps of New Zealand, and this is showing that New Zealand glacier record, Southern Alps glacier record. These are glacial moraines indicating extensive glaciers, and then retreat of glaciers, and then retreat all the way to the Holocene. So this glacier retreat in New Zealand clearly happens before CO2 starts to go up. Okay. So something's going on, and this is the question that I've been digging into with my work in the tropics for over a decade, and trying to figure out, like, can we use sites in the tropics to help us understand this? Because the tropics are such a cool place because they're far away from the ice sheets, right? And they're far away from that Milankovitch forcing. And they're in this really cool special place in the atmosphere. So I'm working on developing those records. But let me introduce this one last thing, and then I'll get into my my data. So there's a new idea that was put out a few years ago, again by this group, and this is something different from Milankovitch. And maybe some of you are already familiar with this. This is something that is an alternative driver for ice age cycles, okay? And it may or may not be the answer, but I think it opens up some interesting questions and some different dynamics. So what this paper is suggesting is that it's not Northern Hemisphere summer insolation forcing at all. It's actually orbital forcing, but it's Southern Hemisphere high latitude summer duration. And changes in that are shown, sorry for the resolution of this. This is seasonal duration in the south. Here's Milankovitch forcing. They look remarkably similar, right, in terms of the pattern of those changes. But it's suggesting that those changes are causing changes in two systems in the Southern Hemisphere, the Southern Tropical Front in the oceans and the westerly wind belt in the atmosphere. And that during a glacial period, when the summer duration is shorter and it's colder, that there's a northward expansion, an equatorward expansion of the Southern Tropical Front and those westerly belts that sort of squishes all of these circulation patterns and leaves Zealandia, this continental mass of New Zealand and Antarctica, to sort of block the ability for the expansion of this, excuse me, yep, that's decoupling, of this Indo-Pacific warm pool and through flow here into the Indian Ocean of warm water. And that this would be more typical of a glacial period, and that when the summer's warm and this southern tropical front and the westerly wind belt can expand poleward, that opens up. It expands the Indo-Pacific warm pool and the ability for that warm water to flow through here and up into the North Atlantic. So completely different mechanism. Okay? I'm interested in investigating this. I wanted to set this up as sort of a problem with a couple different hypotheses. And now I'll show you what I've been working on and sort of how this relates to how we understand this. So my question for much of the work that I've been doing over the past few years is thinking about what role the tropics had in these glacial interglacial cycles. And to me, it would make sense if the tropics have a role because they receive the most solar radiation on Earth, right? They're the warmest place on Earth, and all of that temperature and energy gets pumped out to higher latitudes from the tropics, right? They're also a location because of this incident solar radiation and the prevalence of surface water here for water vapor and precipitation that then also gets pumped out into the rest of the world. So it's essentially the heat engine of the planet, right? This could be causing large changes in the past. And in fact, it's causing most of the large changes we see today with ENSO variability, right? Okay, so what do we know about the tropics in the past? There have been, of course, a lot of efforts to do reconstructions of the tropics in the past with temperature. And these range from 50 years ago, CliMap said what was the global surface temperature using ocean proxies. That's up here. And what they came up with was like, okay, the poles, northern hemisphere poles cooled quite a bit. And the tropics really didn't cool very much at all. And in some places in their initial map, the tropics actually warmed, which is unusual. Margot redid this in 2009 and included not just foraminifera assemblages to reconstruct SSTs, sea surface temperatures, but also geochemical proxies, and came up with this reconstruction here. So a little bit cooler. And find the difference between the solid line and the dashed line is the difference between what they estimate as sea surface and the inferred land surface. So that would be sort of like amplification of temperature over a temperature change over land versus water. And then this is the most recent one by Jess Tierney, which is an incredible reconstruction using proxy data from sea surface temperatures and then incorporating model-based understanding of climate systems into that to do this reconstruction. Okay, so these are all for sea surface temperature. And then this is the most recent one for land. And this was done by Jeff Seltzer, and not Jeff Seltzer, Alan Seltzer. And it was done using noble gases and groundwater. Okay, so you can see the land temperature looks like it's a little bit cooler, and they say that the reason that this is cooler is again because of that amplification of temperature warming and cooling over land. Okay, and this relationship is actually important to understand with future warming, obviously, with how much land versus oceans are going to be warming. One thing I want to point out is that this most recent construction, which focuses on those terrestrial temperatures, doesn't have that many tropical sites, and all of these sites are at low elevation. So what we know about predominantly are low elevation sites. Okay, so I am working on reconstructing tropical temperatures at high elevation sites. This is an area that's been less well studied. There have been studies in the past, but they are hampered by the ability to do precisely dated records and also to infer quantitative temperatures. Okay, so those are really where I feel like the work that I and my students in my group have been doing have really advanced this. And also we're trying to do this thing where we're applying our methods in a very apples to apples way at different sites so that the different sites are intercomparable. And I think this is important because there have been compilations in the past of high altitude temperatures, but they're all different methods, and it's hard to tease out what's methodology and what's actually real. So I will show you, I've been working for over a decade in the site in the Rwenzori Mountains in Uganda. That's a primary data that I'll show you. I'll spend most of the time on that. I've got two new sites. This is about ready to be sort of off of my desk and into review in Costa Rica, and then a site in Colombia where we've just pretty much started working with our collaborators there. And I have some data that are just getting prepared. And then this site in New Guinea, we've never been into the field. I will probably never get into the field. So a lot of that work we're doing is remote. And I won't present that here today, but I'm happy to talk about it. The methods that I use are these primary methods. So I started out with it. I'm a glacial geologist. This is sort of the basis of my work is field work and using now the amazing remote sensing imagery that we have, and then producing really detailed maps so that we can say, what were glacial systems doing and how do these change over space and time. And this is so critical to being able to interpret any of this, right? It's not like a lake record where we can like go up the lake and see this environmental change. You really have to be able to see this spatially. And this is work that actually a student of mine just put out on the Younger Dryas and or not Younger Dryas, ACR in Colombia. So not related to this work, but a beautiful map. I have a cosmogenic dating lab at Dartmouth, so I do cosmogenic dating. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. And I work primarily with Alice Dowdy, who's at University of Maine. She's a glacier modeler, so we run computer models to simulate ice extents. And this is the way that we're actually pulling climate conditions from glaciers. So we're not just simply saying, this glacier extent is equivalent to this temperature, but there's a range of climate conditions that we can infer from this, which is, I think, an advance in terms of what has been done in the past. And if possible, in some cases, we're lucky enough to have the support logistically, financially, student-wise, to work on like sediment records too, which are a great complement to this, because the glacier records are inherently discontinuous, right? Glaciers are these like moments in time that we miss sections with. So if we can tie those together with the lake records, it feels really good to have the, the independent methods and the complementary methods. So my primary proxy that I use is glacier snowline. I'll probably use this term interchangeably, snowline, or what's called the equilibrium line. This is the line that divides ablation area from an accumulation area on a glacier surface. And what I infer is that this line over long periods of time, climatic periods of time, approximates the freezing level in the atmosphere. So if I can pinpoint this at a time in the past, I can say I know something about where that 0-degree isotherm was in the atmosphere, and I can use that as my tracker of climate, okay? Okay, we'll get into this. So there have been a lot of discussions over the past 30 years about whether tropical glaciers respond to temperature or respond to precipitation. This is a charged field of literature. So I have restricted the studies that I do on tropical glaciers to a very narrow latitudinal band that I call the inner humid tropics. This is between 10 degrees south and 10 degrees north. The reason I choose this is because precipitation here is plentiful. And these glaciers receive enough accumulation so that they're not precipitation starved. They're not ablating primarily by sublimation. They're in areas where they can flow down into areas where they have melting along their margins, and that's what's driving mass balance, okay? We've taken a couple different tacks at trying to show this, although it keeps popping up in the literature. This is my student, Joel Wilner, who's doing a PhD. He is a glacier modeler in all different senses, and we did this crazy experiment where we made fake glaciers, in this day and age. Why not? And so we made glaciers on like different types of topography. And just made small changes in the topographic conditions, small changes in the climatic conditions. I think he ran something like 10 or 20,000 different simulations. And these are the data from that to pull out what are the parameters that are most important to glacier length. And so we can split this out as sort of big picture climatic versus topographic. And you can see that climate is the large impact, even though these are thin mountain glaciers. Right? They're not like these big ice sheets. They still don't care that much about topography. And then we can split this out even more and say that by far temperature is the biggest player in glacier mass balance and ultimate glacier length. The other thing we've done with modeling, this is from Alice Dowdy's recent paper, and this is now in the Rwenzori, is that we've simulated glaciers in the Rwenzori using different climatic conditions as well. This is plotting freezing level height versus equilibrium line altitude. And so along this dashed line would show us that equilibrium line of a glacier is exactly related to the freezing level height. And what Alice has done here was change the amount of accumulation on glaciers. This is a range from sort of 4 meters per year down to 0.75 meters per year. So from wet conditions to dry conditions. And we can say that, here just above 2, maybe to 2 to 3 meters per year, when glaciers receive that much precipitation in this climate range, their ELAs that we're pulling off of them are reflecting freezing line elevation. Okay. And in the case of the Rwenzori, that's what most of the glaciers are receiving. Okay. Okay, so I do this too. I use cosmogenic nuclides. I'll do a really brief overview of this. So this is the idea that cosmogenic nuclides in Earth's surface are produced over time because of incoming cosmic rays that are charged particles high energy particles at the top of the atmosphere that cause a cascade of spallation reactions throughout the atmosphere, producing more charged particles that eventually make their way down into the lithosphere and produce reactions in molecules in the lithosphere. And this is an example of the oxygen 18 in quartz or anything else that has oxygen in it, spalling to form beryllium-10, which is the nuclide that ultimately I measure. I do this in glacial environments, so I assume that once a glacier deglaciates, those nuclides start to form in the exposed lithosphere or ground up rocks on the surface, and that when a glacier covers an area, that it erodes all of that material so that it removes any nuclides that had existed prior to that most recent glacial extent. Okay, let me go back here and just remind you, I'm going to start talking about details of our data from our results from Uganda. So this is a pretty incredible site. It's in East Africa. It is one of the three currently glaciated regions in East Africa. It's here between Lakes Albert and Edward. Mount Kenya and Kilimanjaro are also glaciated, as you know, but those are Rift Valley volcanoes, primarily made of basalts, and there's not a lot of opportunity to do beryllium-10 cosmogenic nuclide dating there. And so we have selected to work here. It's a really weird situation where it's like in this rift zone, it's a uplifted horst basement rock. So very strange and amazing area. Incredibly beautiful. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. If you ever get to travel, I would highly recommend it. It's a wonderful place to do trekking. These are the three currently glaciated peaks. So Mount Stanley, Mount Baker here, and Mount Speke. Mount Stanley is about 5,000 meters above sea level, and you can see just this beautiful glacial environment with crystalline bedrock and beautiful U-shaped valleys, glacially carved lakes, scoured features. It really does feel like it feels like a weird place to be as a glacial geologist. Sometimes I feel like I'm in a Dr. Seuss book because I feel like it looks like the tropics, but then there were glaciers here. So it's a fun experience. It's a really fun experience to bring students into. And this is what glacial geology looks like in the Rwenzori. So there are moraines here. This is a long valley called the Mubuku Valley that I'll focus on. And do you see this ridge here? And the partner of it over here? So that was the last glacial maximum extent of ice in this mountain range. Really amazing. It's very low. This is almost just below 3,000 meters above sea level. So glaciers got quite low during the LGM. And this is how that looks sort of on land. It's vegetation covered. So these are actually these sort of like tree-lined ridges here are the moraines. This is a retreat extent going up that valley. And here's one other picture. All right, it's the most fun part of the talk is the pictures, right? This is another glacier extent that you can actually see really well. So this is a moraine. The glacier's flowing from the left to the right here. And you can see here, this is the moraine with the boulders on the surface. And there's another little one right behind it here. Oh, yeah. You can see this one really well because there's a fire here. And so it burned the whole area. So it's not covered with vegetation. Otherwise, it's not like mapping in Greenland or something. Well, it's vegetation covered. So I'll take you to two sites where we have data. The first will be the Mubuku Valley. That was the site I was just showing, and the secondary site is Muliambuya. And these are just the data for the LGM. We have a whole record that goes through the end of the last ice age and into the Holocene. So this is what glacial geology, this is what we start with. This is a digital elevation model on which we've overlaid a contour map. We use that digital elevation model and satellite imagery to do the initial mapping. We go into the field and then we start, highlighting our glacial deposits. And what you can see are two valleys here merging together. Up here in the Mubuku, and then the red are what we've outlined as the glacial moraine deposits that are from the LGM. And there are ridges, like the big ridges I showed you in that picture, and then the till that lines the valley floor. And what's in green are moraines. I call them undifferentiated because we don't know the age of them. We haven't dated them. I would love to get back and date them, but we don't know. They're certainly older than LGM, which is interesting. Okay. So this is sort of tuning you into ice flow patterns down the valleys. And then these are our chronology that we've developed for this site. And when I went here initially, Jim Russell had been working here for a number of years, and he was like, we should date moraines there. And so I went and I got into the field, and there's just so much vegetation. And I was like, there's no way this is going to work. Not a chance. And then, so we started dating these moraines, and I think this is the first data set we got back, and I was like, I cannot believe this. So it really is, for beryllium dating, a remarkably consistent data set. So we date a number of boulders on a moraine ridge to make sure that we're not, having a lot of scatter, or to see if there are outliers. But this is a remarkable data set. You can see that the oldest moraine here is this little ridge. Out here, it's starting at about 29,000 years ago. There was a step back to the ridge inside of it. And then it again, sort of 28 to 29, and then a step back to 25. And then ice sort of changed its tune a little bit. And I don't know why, in terms of ice dynamics, would be a good question. And there was a big flush of ice down the valley, and that was the maximum, 21.5. Okay. There's retreat up the valley here. I would say by like 18,000 years ago, the ice had already melted from this maximum out here, part of the way up valley. Okay. There's one other site just to bolster this in that Mulliambuli Valley, which is a little bit further down to the south. This is actually a retreat moraine. So the LGM is a little bit further down valley, and we did not have the opportunity to sample it, but this also shows a really nice data set of ice retreat up the valley. Okay. I mentioned that when we have the opportunity to do other methods, we do. So this is a lake. It's called Lake Mahoma. It's a really cool site. And we had the opportunity. We'd been working here for a number of years. We finally got funding from NSF to do this project. And we had enough to go back and do some lake coring. So we did that. This is our coring raft on Lake Mahoma. And this is the bottommost core. Overlapping cores, so two different cores, and it's about 4 meters down in the core, so the bottommost of those. And you can see here this gray is the clastic sediment that's shed off the glacier and probably shed off of the landscape when the glacier was active. And then that transitions to brown, which is what I would call yicha, or the sort of typical organic sediment that's deposited in sort of modern Holocene lakes. And it's full of organic matter. And so in 2 independent cores, we've dated this transition twice, and that transition comes up to be 21,004, 20,005 calendar. So this is awesome, because very few people believe this data set, particularly this data set, because of the vegetation and the beryllium production rates. There's all kinds of questions about this. But now we can say, with deglaciation, this lake, organic sedimentation started in this lake at 21.3 or 21.4. That aligns remarkably with the beryllium 10 ages. So this is like, oh, when science works. And 2 proxies really reinforce each other, right? That's pretty cool. So that was really amazing. So now we know the timing of ice extents there. And what we want to figure out is, what can they tell us about climate, right? So this is where the modeling comes in. And this is Alice Dowdy's ice sheet model. It's a 2D ice sheet model. It incorporates ice flow in one model, and then it has a surface energy balance model that interacts with that ice flow model. So basically what we do is we have a digital elevation model, and on that digital elevation model, we superimpose this ice flow model and drive that with the surface energy balance model, for which we can say, okay, let's just dial climate to whatever we think, right? So we can say we're going to decrease temperature, we're going to decrease precip or increase precip, and we can test out all these different scenarios. And what we're trying to do ultimately is hit this point where we know that we've mapped and dated that ice extent. We're trying to get the climate conditions for that ice extent. And you can see here is the temperature change, precip change from present. There is not a unique solution to this, right? These are what the solutions look like. So this is a paper that Alice put out more recently, and it shows that each one of these squares is what I would call a successful model run. So it modeled that glacier in that valley to within 100 meters of where we've mapped and dated those moraines. And it's a range, right? So you can see the temperature change from modern here, and this is temperature at sea level. This is not temperature at that high altitude. So we're comparing that with some sea surface temperatures here. So we dialed that back. And then this is precipitation change. And in this case, because of the paleoproxy data, we're pretty sure it was drier in this area. And like we're doing this in South America, and there's a question of like, is it wetter, is it drier? And then the other thing we're starting to play with, and I'll get into this, is the lapse rate. So this is the modern lapse rate. So the lapse rate is a decrease in temperature with elevation. So you go up in elevation, this is the modern lapse rate. And this is lapse rates estimated from the literature for this area during the LGM. And what you can see is that the pink is the approximate drying indicated by pollen and lake level, other proxy data. This is a temperature range inferred from the nearest sites from the Tierney reconstruction, 2020 reconstruction. And the only way that we actually get into anywhere close to the range of what's shown by other proxy data is by inferring the lapse rate change. Okay, which is why this is starting to get really interesting. And Jim has been doing this for a number of years. So Jim Russell at Brown University uses GDGTs, similar to Tim here and Victoria, to tell temperatures using lake sediments. And this is based on these crazy organic chemistry of membrane lipids that are produced by archaean bacteria, and that these amounts of sort of carbon chains in the membranes are temperature dependent. And Tim and Victoria will tell you more about this. I am not going to sit up here and lecture about it. But what Jim has done is he's done a lot of work calibrating this method to lakes in East Africa, okay? And developing records from lakes in East Africa. So here's these lake records from 4 lakes over time, so from the 25,000 years ago until now, and each one of these is a temperature record from different lakes. And we were able to, now that we know the timing of the LGM in this area, really isolate that time of the LGM, right? And so you can see there are these long temperature records, but one thing we can do, and what Jim's student Shannon Loomis has done, who actually came here and worked briefly with him as a postdoc, I believe, is she could plot the LGM temperature change from those lake records at different elevations, just for the LGM, right? And so that's this. So here's the LGM temperature inferred from those lakes and the elevations of the lakes. And what she could come up with then was actually like calculating a lapse rate through the LGM, which is really cool. And it shows us that in fact, that lapse rate, which is here compared to the modern, was steeper during the LGM. And what to me that indicates is that the atmosphere was likely drier. And we sort of know this from the pollen and the lake level records, but this, as far as I understand, is one of the first paleoproxy data sets to actually track the lapse rate in the past. Okay. So really fun, really interesting, like combining all these data sets together. I just want to show you one more somewhat related. So this is another student of Jim's, Sloan Gerlich, who did this type of branch GDGT record from that Mahoma lake core. So this is the lake core that is right set within the moraines that we're dating. And this is time here on the x-axis, and then elevation that reflects, these are the moraines and the moraine ages. And then over here is temperature, and that is what this line here is plotted for. So this line is the temperature from the lake record, and these are the elevations, simply the elevations of the different moraines and the ages of them that we're dating. So you can see a really nice correspondence between temperatures and glacier extents here. So again, coming back to that question or that argument of what's driving these tropical glaciers. This also, if we just plot snow line versus time, if we pull off ELAs from the model runs, it looks very similar to that temperature record from the lake. Okay. Okay, let me fast forward through the rest. Okay, so really interesting results from Uganda. We had this combination of methods. We're coming up with the ability to date things, tell the timing of glaciation, derive temperatures from glaciers, and ideally have a paleo proxy for the lapse rate. I'm trying to do this now. The question I have now is this one site in the tropics, or is it throughout the tropics, right? And so we're trying to find places in this interhumid tropics where we can apply the similar methodology, and then we have to, get the funding and all that stuff. But we've started to do this in Costa Rica, so I'm going to show you very briefly the data from there, and then our preliminary data from Colombia. And I won't be as long, I promise, is how I talked about Uganda. So this is the site in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has no glaciers today, but there were glaciers here in the Chirripó National Park. The Cerro Chirripó is in that national park. It's the highest peak in Costa Rica, and it was glaciated during the last ice age. And it is one of these beautiful environments where you're like, wow, I'm in the tropics and it's amazing. And when you stand on this peak, you can see the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, and you feel like you're really tropical. And then you look down and there's like this beautiful U-shaped valley with glacially carved lakes in it. And it's so cool. And it's named the Valle de las Morenas. Oh, it's like, you get there like, okay, this is done already. This is a photo of what some of those moraines look like. This is taken by my student, Liesel. And you can see across the valley, the ice flowed from the left to the right. And you see these beautiful lateral moraines that come down here and mark that ice extent all the way down the valley. Just fabulous. And we've done the same methods. We've done the mapping. And this is my student Caleb and I doing mapping and sampling. The cool thing here is that there are basaltic rocks that have some like weird hydrothermal quartz veins in them. So we have the opportunity to do both beryllium and helium-3 cosmogenic nuclide dating here. So we're going to have like dual nuclides to do this. This is our beryllium chronology so far. So we have two valleys, that Valle de las Morenas and this Valle Talari. Cerro Chirripó is right here. So extending sort of in both different directions, really different climate systems sort of fed by different oceans. And you can see the outermost moraines up here. Those are the outermost sort of lateral moraine, left lateral moraine, and then outermost moraines down here. Date to about 19 to 18,000 years ago. And then retreat was really rapid, right? This is a lower elevation site than the Rwenzori. And I think what we're seeing here is that like rising of snowline really, really quickly, warming really quickly at the end of the last ice age. So deglaciation up in the Valle de los Morenas, where we can track it better because there are a lot of moraines, happens almost instantaneously. And this site, my guess, is deglaciated by like 17 to 18,000 years ago. Okay. We're doing modeling here too. This is Liesel's master's thesis. And the cool thing here, oh, it's a slower model, is that we have two targets. So we can better constrain that ice extent because we've got two valley glaciers we're trying to meet, not just one. We can do the same things where we're pulling off temperature and precip. And looking at experiments where we change the lapse rate. And I don't have a beautiful plot of that just yet. We're working on it. And then the last site where we're working is a new site for me. It's in the Western Cordillera of Colombia here. It's a place called the Páramo del Sol or the Páramo Frontino. It's a really weird, like collapsed volcanic complex, but you can see in this otherwise very green area of Colombia, it's eroded off. And it's amazing. The highest peak is similar to the peak in Costa Rica. It's about 4,000 meters. We conducted field work there almost 2 years ago now, and we're still working on the mapping and dating and the glacier modeling. But it's a beautiful site. I mean, it has these high peaks, and then there's just this plain that's been like planed off by glaciers. Really incredible glacial erosional features, rouge moutonnées and striations, all over the place, glacial boulders. I think you can see right there. And then like incredible U-shaped valleys, right? Again, in these tropical environments, it's really, really fantastic glacial features. This is our preliminary chronology for this. So it's a more complicated site to map because number one, the remote imagery is not very good. So we have a really hard time seeing things, and vegetation is everywhere here once you get off that upper plateau. But we basically on the southern end of the range track a moraine system that comes down into one valley, the Santa Barbara Valley, comes up over an interfluve and back down to the El Quince Valley. And samples on this indicate that that outermost moraine extent was 19,000. And those are nice, repeatable numbers that we're getting from those moraines. There are samples outside of this that were probably outside of that glacial limit, is how I interpret that scatter. And then ice retreated up onto this plateau, and we're trying to sort of sort out these messier data up here. But my guess is that this plateau is deglaciated by sort of 16 to 17K. We're doing modeling there too. This is another part of Joel's PhD thesis. This is a model, it doesn't work very well. So, I mean, this is sort of like the trial and error, right? So we have the DEM, we have some information about climate, and then those are the outer moraine set that we're trying to match. And this is going way too far, but you can see it's a very cold 9.5 temperature degrees C from modern with no precip change. But sort of fun to like be like, well, yep, that's too much. Okay, so let me summarize and wrap up because I know I'm getting short on time. 2 main points, and then I'll talk a teeny bit about big picture. That what we're showing is that glacial records across the tropics, which I think we can strongly argue registered temperature changes, indicate significant high altitude cooling, and that this cooling happened simultaneously with the LGM. I know this might seem simple, but like in the literature, this is something that is still debated. And that the cooling that's required for glaciers to reach these extents in these locations requires a change in the lapse rate. We've shown that in the Rwenzori, indicating that there was probably a change in relative humidity, atmospheric water vapor in that area, which influences the lapse rate. And we're trying to see if we can figure that out here. Okay, to see if that was a tropics-wide phenomenon. These glacial and lake records also indicate warming by at least 18 to 17, if not earlier. Rwenzori is definitely earlier. So there's some signal in the tropics that's causing glaciers to retreat, and that is before CO2 goes up. So that is not a greenhouse gas driver. And that I can show here. These are just the Rwenzori data, the moraine ages plotted as probability plots. From all the moraines we've dated, these are the 2 retreat moraines. And these are happening. So ice retreat is happening sort of in this zone where things are getting like pinkish. And this is where ice is like all the way up valley. And that's prior to when CO2 or collected greenhouse gas forcing is going up. Okay. I'm really interested in this. These are both figures I've shown, and it's just like a review. So in the Rwenzori, we have this amazing ability to demonstrate changes in the lapse rate. I think that like having that proxy to tell us something about water vapor could be really interesting, and I'm really interested to continue working on this through the glacier work, but also combining low elevation and high elevation records. And I guess I would leave this question, oops, let me skip that and I'll go back to it. Coming back to this idea that these changes in the southern hemisphere circulation are causing changes in this Indo-Pacific warm pool, which is basically the area in the world that's pumping out water vapor, a potent greenhouse gas. That could we be tracking those changes, right? And could more development of records like this provide insight into answering the question of, is this a viable hypothesis for glacier interglacial change? The last thing I'll mention, then I'll stop, is that understanding this tropical lapse rate is important for current and future change. The lapse rate, the tropical lapse rate, is a really critical negative feedback on climate and on global temperature. And understanding it and getting it right is really important. So this is a excerpt from Shannon's paper that was then further developed by the later student Sloan Gerlich. And what it shows is a comparison of model output from the CMIP6 model, which is shown in the colored boxes, of temperature difference from the LGM to modern at these different locations, right? And so it looks like that in the red are the proxy data. So those are the lake branch UTIG records. So it looks like, sea surface, the low elevation records are doing okay in terms of what's shown in the models. And once we get to higher elevation, the model isn't reproducing the temperature decrease that's seen at elevation, okay? It's underestimating that. And that also means it's underestimating the magnitude of temperature change at high elevation during the LGM. And if those models are not doing that for the LGM, the question is, are they doing this right for the modern and going into the future? So this is something that I think these data can also be useful for helping better predict climate change using modeling. I will leave it at that. These are my acknowledgements. Thank you so much.
Okay, Ginny had to step out, so I'm going to handle the questions here, and I'm sure that we have some time. Oh, Ginny's still here. Anyway, students can go first, so let's have any student questions.
Hi, that was a really wonderful talk. I am kind of unfamiliar with like glaciers in this region, and I was just wondering if there's like any sort of estimation as to like how much sea level contribution some of these might have.
During the last ice age or?
During the last glacial maximum, yeah.
Oh, probably really minor.
Okay.
Mountain glaciers today, the melting of mountain glaciers today is contributing probably the most to sea level, but that includes these like large mountain glaciers in Alaska and Patagonia and stuff. So these guys are tiny.
Okay.
I mean, they were bigger during the LGM, but I don't think it was like usually.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I like that question of I wasn't so familiar with this, that there were glaciers here. I feel like there sometimes I give talks and people are like, there were glaciers in the tropics. It's a weird environment.
That was a really awesome talk. I'm deep in the ice sheet modeling world, so this is an amazing talk to give me more perspective. But Joel had an interesting result about precipitation and temperature driving changes in these high latitude tropic glaciers, and I'm wondering if we were to repeat the same modeling study across these different sites, if that percentage would change depending on like topography mattering more, because that's a stronger story, at least for the polar ice sheets and tidal glaciers. So yeah, I'm curious if that's like a changing result based on these different areas.
That's a good question. So we took the Sierra Nevada de Calcuy, which is a tropical site in Colombia, where we've done some work as sort of the case study, and it's like just this north-south trending mountain range, and the glaciers are on the west side of it. And we just took that like, solar radiation there and temperature, like modern, to test that. And the glaciers are thin, but they have plentiful accumulation. And your question about taking it to the poles is really interesting to think about, like the thin polar glaciers, because they have so much less accumulation. I wonder if topography can have more of an influence. It'd be a really interesting study to do. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just like people constantly question what's driving tropical glacier length, whether it's precipitation or topography. And we've been trying to different ways to get at that. And I think that part of this aspect, his foot was focused on topography, but the climate results came out of that as well. Yeah.
Question. How about time for one more quick question? We can short time.
Oh. Yeah, that was a great talk. Question about the modeling. How do you deal with erosion in the modeling and changing bedrock boundary conditions?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And it's one of the biggest problems with the model is like there is not an erosive nature of that model. It's simply a 2D ice flow model, and we're not taking material out. And in addition, we're using the modern topography. So if there was a place that had a glacially scoured valley that then has been filled in with sediment after the glacier retreated, right? So like I imagine the Swiss Alps, like the Rhone Valley has like 1,000 meters of sediment fill since like the last glacial period, right? That's not the case here. In a lot of cases, you can see bedrock, but there are places probably in that valley where there's glacial fill, and we just have to assume we don't have any, pre-fill topographic maps, and we don't have like the geophysics to figure that out either. So, it's a great question.
All right, great. If you have more questions and you want to talk to Meredith more, we're going to go over to Austin Beer Works about 5 o'clock. So join us there if you will. And let's thank Meredith one more time.
Well.